Breaking today, Meghan Markle breaks her agreement with King Charles and Buckingham Palace to leak to her friends at
For one brief moment, the war between Meghan and the monarchy appeared to have reached a fragile ceasefire. A private promise had reportedly been made to the king, offering reassurance that certain royal matters would remain protected. But within days, disturbing whispers began spreading through palace corridors. The timing could not have been more delicate. The monarchy was moving through a period in which every appearance, every absence, and every family gesture carried enormous weight. Public unity was not simply preferred, it had become essential. That made any private agreement with Meghan politically dangerous. Because one wrong move could reopen wounds the palace had spent months trying to contain. Yet King Charles reportedly took the risk. Despite warnings from senior courtiers, he authorized a discreet channel of communication with Harry and Meghan. It was not a grand reconciliation. No emotional reunion had been promised. No royal role was being restored. The king's aim was far more controlled, fewer accusations, fewer private conversations reaching the public, and no sudden disruption surrounding official royal events. The boundaries were said to be clear. Discussions involving the king would remain private. Any future family contact would be handled carefully. Sensitive information would not pass through friends, advisors, or media figures. Meghan reportedly agreed, offering the reassurance Charles needed before allowing the channel to remain open. For Harry, the meaning went deeper. He saw the agreement as proof that his father had not completely abandoned him. Behind the rules and restrictions, there was still a door. Narrow, guarded, and uncertain, but open. William was far less convinced. He feared that renewed access could become something else: publicity, leverage, or a carefully shaped narrative presented to the world before the palace had time to respond. His concern was not only what might be said. It was how a private moment could be repackaged, softened, and released through people who appeared unconnected. Palace aides reportedly insisted the promise remain verbal. Nothing was signed. Nothing was placed in writing. Their fear was brutally simple. Even the agreement itself could become a leak. Charles chose hope over caution. He believed restraint might finally replace retaliation. But trusted advisors warned that sentiment was exposing the crown to a familiar danger. And the palace's greatest fear was not an explosive accusation. It was one tiny detail. A phrase. A condition. Something only a handful of people knew. Days later, a media inquiry arrived using language disturbingly close to the private discussion. What seemed like an innocent question from the press soon forced the palace to confront a terrifying possibility. Someone had carried the king's private words beyond the walls almost immediately. The first warning did not arrive through a television interview or a dramatic public statement. It came quietly, hidden inside a journalist's carefully worded request for comment. The question referenced a private condition allegedly discussed with Meghan, a condition palace officials believed had never left the room. That condition was tied to future contact between Harry, Meghan, and the king. Any meeting, phone call, or family discussion would depend on one basic rule: what was said in private would stay private. There would be no sudden interviews, no friendly briefings, and no carefully placed details appearing before the palace could respond. But the journalist knew too much. The wording was not broad enough to be dismissed as ordinary speculation. It reflected the language used during the confidential exchange with unsettling precision. Palace officials reportedly believed only 5 people knew the exact terms: Charles, Harry, Meghan, one senior royal aide, and the trusted intermediary who had helped arrange the communication. Inside the press office, the response was delayed. Publicly, there was silence. Privately, senior aides began tracing calls, messages, and conversations, trying to understand how the information had escaped so quickly. Some believed the leak was not a full account at all. It may have been a carefully selected fragment, released to test public reaction before the complete story emerged. That possibility made it even more dangerous. A strategic leak could shape sympathy, influence headlines, and force the palace into defending conditions it had never intended to reveal. For Charles, the discovery carried a deeper wound. He had defended the decision to reopen communication. He had ignored warnings and trusted that the promise would hold. Now, only days later, that trust appeared to be weakening beneath him. William reportedly demanded that all further contact with California be paused until the source was identified. To him, the pattern was already clear. Harry's response was immediate. Neither he nor Meghan had spoken to the journalist, he insisted. The information could just as easily have come from someone inside the palace. That defense only sharpened the conflict between the brothers. William saw it as predictable. Harry saw the accusation as proof that the supposed reconciliation had always been built on suspicion. Then courtiers noticed something more troubling. The journalist's language did not merely describe the agreement. It presented Meghan as restricted, mistrusted, and unfairly controlled. Someone had not only supplied the condition, they appeared to have supplied the emotional meaning behind it. And before the palace could contain the damage, word arrived that another report was already being prepared. The palace might have contained one suspicious question, but the situation changed when a second outlet approached with details no outsider should have possessed. And this time, Meghan's perspective appeared at the center of the story. To the king, the incident felt painful. To veteran palace advisors, it felt familiar. They had seen private tensions become public narratives before, often through anonymous voices claiming to understand Meghan's emotions. Now the same pattern appeared to be forming around the promise she had just made. The palace had lived through this kind of uncertainty before. Private disagreements would surface through unnamed friends, sympathetic commentators, or sources described only as being close to the Sussexes. No direct statement was required. A carefully chosen phrase could travel from one conversation to another until it appeared in print, carrying the force of an official response. That was why senior courtiers did not believe the investigation depended on proving Meghan had personally contacted a journalist. Information could move through advisors, representatives, trusted friends, or intermediaries who understood exactly how to shape a story without leaving an obvious trail. As the new reports were examined, palace officials reportedly began comparing their language with phrases used during the private agreement. The similarities were difficult to ignore. The articles presented Meghan as cooperative and willing to rebuild trust, but also trapped by a palace that remained suspicious, rigid, and determined to control her voice. That framing changed the meaning of the entire agreement. What Charles viewed as protection for private family discussions was being described as an attempt to silence Meghan. Responsibility shifted quietly. The leak itself became secondary, while the monarchy appeared to be the aggressor imposing unfair conditions. Charles was caught in a brutal emotional conflict. Publicly condemning Meghan might satisfy advisors demanding a response, but it could also destroy what remained of his relationship with Harry. Camilla reportedly warned that continued silence could be mistaken for weakness, especially if more private details emerged. Harry's anxiety deepened. Meghan believed the palace had already decided she was guilty and was simply searching for evidence to justify the accusation. From her perspective, royal aides were free to discuss the agreement behind closed doors while she was expected to tell no one, not even those she trusted. That raised a dangerous question. Had Meghan understood the promise differently? Perhaps she believed she had agreed not to speak publicly herself. Charles and his advisors, however, believed the commitment extended to everyone around her. That gap in interpretation may have created the opening through which the secret escaped. Then the internal inquiry uncovered something far more serious, a communication sent only hours before the first journalist contacted the palace. That communication would become the turning point. because it connected the private royal agreement to someone operating within Meghan's wider circle and forced the palace to decide whether coincidence was still believable. For days, the palace possessed suspicion but no clear path toward the truth. Then investigators reportedly discovered a brief message sent across time zones shortly after Meghan's conversation with the king. It contained no direct confession, yet its timing and wording transformed unease into something far more serious. The message did not repeat the entire discussion. It did something more subtle. It allegedly summarized Meghan's emotional reaction to the conditions Charles had placed around future contact. She was presented as disappointed, restricted, and once again expected to accept rules created without her voice carrying equal weight. On its own, that might have looked like a private expression of frustration. But the recipient reportedly had connections across entertainment, media, and public relations circles. Networks where one emotional sentence could travel quickly, changing shape with every conversation. Palace advisors argued that this was precisely why the promise mattered. Meghan did not need to quote the king directly to expose the discussion. By sharing the emotional meaning behind his conditions, she could reveal the heart of the agreement without repeating its exact wording. Then investigators found the phrase that changed everything. A description used in the private message later appeared almost unchanged in a journalist's account of Meghan's position. The resemblance was too close to ignore. To the palace, it looked like a line had moved from a confidential exchange into the wider media world. Meghan's side reportedly rejected that interpretation. The message, they insisted, had been sent in confidence to someone she trusted. It was a request for emotional support, not permission to contact reporters or shape headlines. Harry was trapped between both explanations. He understood why his wife needed someone outside the royal system to speak to. But he also knew his father had asked for absolute discretion. Charles had not merely requested silence from Meghan. He believed he had secured protection from the entire chain through which private information could escape. That made the king's disappointment deeply personal. He had reportedly overruled advisors to allow the conversation. He had taken a risk as a father, only to feel that his confidence had been exposed before the arrangement even had time to work. William's reaction was colder. He suspected the information had been allowed to travel so the palace would appear harsh and controlling before Meghan's conduct could be questioned. Perhaps she never intended that outcome. Perhaps she simply underestimated how quickly private frustration moves through powerful networks. But inside the palace, one question dominated. Did intent matter when the damage was already done? A confidential timeline was assembled. Calls, messages, media inquiries, and public responses placed in exact order. At its center, aides located the promise Meghan allegedly made and the detail that surfaced days later. With the timeline complete, the central question could no longer be delayed. What exactly had Meghan promised the king? And how quickly had that promise been broken? The answer was more damaging than palace officials expected. Meghan had reportedly assured the king that private discussions about Harry's royal future, family access, and public appearances would remain confidential. Yet within days, the central condition of that conversation was circulating through sympathetic media voices almost word for word. The promise was said to be direct. Meghan would not reveal the agreement herself, nor allow its private details to move indirectly through friends, advisors, representatives, or trusted contacts. Future royal communication depended on strict privacy, advanced coordination, and an understanding that family conversations would never be turned into public ammunition. But the emerging reports told a different story. They claimed Meghan believed the palace was demanding her silence while offering little in return: no real security, no meaningful inclusion, and no guarantee that royal insiders would stop briefing against her. The wording did not merely expose Charles's condition, it reflected Meghan's emotional response to it, suggesting the source understood both sides of the conversation. For palace officials, that was the decisive point. The promise had been broken. Whether the information reached the media through a direct briefing, an approving signal, or careless disclosure to someone trusted no longer changed the result. A private agreement had entered the public arena within days. Charles reportedly felt humiliated. He had ignored warnings, reopened a channel others wanted closed, and trusted that this attempt would be different. Instead, the leak appeared to confirm every fear his advisors had placed before him. Harry pushed back. Meghan had not personally contacted the journalist, he argued. She had not given an interview or released a statement. Therefore, in his eyes, she had not technically violated her word. The palace rejected that defense. A royal promise, officials believed, was not protected by narrow wording. It carried responsibility for what happened afterward. Sharing confidential emotions with someone connected to powerful media networks created a risk that could not simply be dismissed as accidental. Meghan's private position was equally firm. She believed the arrangement forced her into silence, while palace figures remained free to shape their own version through unnamed sources. From her perspective, any disclosure may have been defensive, a preemptive attempt to protect herself before failed negotiations were blamed entirely on her. William refused to accept the distinction. To him, predictable leakage through trusted allies was still leakage. Charles then made his decision. Every proposed concession involving Harry and Meghan was to be frozen immediately. The broken promise had now been exposed, but the leak itself was only the beginning. Charles's response would transform a private breach of trust into a wider battle over access, inheritance, titles, and Harry's place within the monarchy. Charles did not respond with a public accusation. There was no furious statement, no dramatic removal of titles, and no televised confrontation. Instead, the king chose a quieter form of punishment, one designed to close doors without creating the spectacle Meghan and Harry's critics believed they expected. The first change was almost invisible. Plans for future private meetings with Harry were reportedly suspended unless senior palace officials were present. Any direct conversation would now be monitored, recorded through formal channels, and protected by layers of caution. What had briefly looked like a path back to personal trust was becoming another controlled royal process. Other possibilities began disappearing just as quietly. Invitations were no longer discussed. Family access became uncertain. Conversations about ceremonial appearances, private gatherings, and future occasions faded without official rejection. Nothing was publicly cancelled because almost nothing had been formally offered. For Harry, that silence carried a devastating message. He had reportedly hoped the reopened communication might lead to a defined place at future royal events, not a return to full duty, but some recognition that he still belonged to the family. Now even that limited hope appeared to be slipping away. Charles's advisors urged him to separate personal affection from institutional privilege. He could remain a father, they argued, without giving Harry access to the machinery of the crown. But the distinction was painful. Charles still wanted contact with his son. What he no longer trusted was the environment surrounding that contact and the possibility that every private exchange might become public material. William supported firm restrictions. In his view, repeated breaches threatened more than family feelings. They weakened the monarchy's ability to plan, negotiate, and protect sensitive decisions from outside pressure. Harry saw something very different. To him, the freeze looked like collective punishment based on suspicion rather than proof. Meghan was equally frustrated. Charles's silence, she believed, allowed hostile voices to define the scandal while the palace avoided responsibility for its own briefings. The consequences reached beyond meetings and invitations. Questions emerged about access to family archives, historic objects, private residences, inherited traditions, and forms of symbolic recognition that carried value far beyond money. Palace officials reportedly began reviewing which ceremonies and private occasions could safely include the Sussexes. That was the power of Charles's response. Nothing had to be taken away. Doors simply stopped opening. Yet as the restrictions tightened, Harry's anger began to change direction. The palace had imposed the punishment, but someone closer may have created the crisis that made it possible. As the palace quietly closed ranks, the strain moved inside Harry and Meghan's home, where the question was no longer simply who leaked, but who had understood the promise, who had ignored the danger, and who would carry the blame. For Harry, the crisis became painfully personal. Defending Meghan meant challenging his father's version of betrayal. Defending Charles meant admitting that Meghan's wider circle may have destroyed their last opportunity for trust. Every path demanded loyalty, and every choice threatened to cost him someone he loved. Harry believed the palace had always judged Meghan by a different standard. Her private conversations were treated as possible offenses, while anonymous royal briefings were dismissed as normal palace practice. To him, the hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. Yet this time, the damage was harder to explain away. Meghan insisted that speaking to trusted people for emotional support was not the same as leaking to the press. She had felt cornered, she argued, and needed advice from those who understood the pressure surrounding her. But Harry began asking a more difficult question. Had everyone around her understood how sensitive the conversation truly was? That question opened a deeper conflict between them. How much royal information should advisors, friends, or business partners be allowed to know? Meghan believed isolation had once left her powerless. She refused to return to a system where silence protected the institution while leaving her unable to defend herself. Harry understood her anger, but he also feared the consequences. Another public battle could end his private relationship with Charles permanently. The fragile channel his father had opened was already closing, and every new statement risked sealing it forever. A tense disagreement followed. Should they issue a direct denial, say nothing, or release their complete account before the palace shaped the story beyond repair? Meghan favored controlled transparency. Silence, she believed, would allow the monarchy to portray her as guilty without producing evidence. Harry warned that revealing more details to prove she had not leaked would only strengthen the palace's accusation. They would be defending confidentiality by breaking it again. Their professional advisors reportedly viewed the controversy as a reputational emergency. In that world, unanswered claims become accepted truths, and accepted truths can damage partnerships, public support, and future opportunities. But Harry was not thinking only about headlines or business. He was thinking about his father. He wanted to protect what little family connection remained. Meghan wanted to protect her name. Then she began considering a more dangerous response. One that would not merely deny the accusation, but expose how palace officials had quietly communicated with the press themselves. Harry wanted the controversy contained, but Meghan believed containment would leave her permanently branded as the betrayer, and her next decision threatened to reveal that the palace had been playing its own hidden game. Meghan's strongest defense was also her most dangerous weapon. If the palace accused her of leaking, she could reveal how royal officials had quietly shaped stories about her for years. But exposing that machinery would require releasing more private evidence and breaking the very boundary at the heart of the scandal. Her possible response was not simply a denial. Advisors reportedly began gathering messages, timelines, and earlier media reports that appeared to follow private palace disputes with suspicious speed. The goal was to build a pattern, one showing that selective disclosure had never belonged to one side alone. Meghan's argument was simple but explosive. The monarchy could not demand total confidentiality from her while benefiting from anonymous commentary attributed to palace insiders. If private information had repeatedly appeared through royal sources, then accusing her alone of betrayal would expose a double standard at the center of the institution. That possibility alarmed the palace. Even partial evidence could revive old questions about who received protection, whose reputation was sacrificed, and whether certain family members were defended while others were left exposed. The leak controversy could suddenly become something much larger, an examination of the hidden system used to manage royal image. Charles reportedly sent a warning through intermediaries. Any release of private correspondence, even as a defense, would end confidential discussions for the foreseeable future. The message placed Meghan inside a painful trap. Protect her reputation, and Harry might lose his remaining connection to his father. Remain silent, and the accusation could harden into accepted truth. Harry opposed releasing private messages. He understood the damage they could cause. Yet he also understood why Meghan refused to carry the entire blame while palace voices operated without names or accountability. William prepared for a longer battle. The more evidence Meghan threatened to expose, the more determined he became to build a permanent wall between the Sussexes and the future reign. Then another strategy emerged. Meghan could avoid speaking directly and allow a close ally to challenge the palace narrative in an interview, article, or carefully timed public appearance. She would not name Charles. She might not even mention the agreement. But the meaning would be unmistakable. The danger was impossible to miss. Such an indirect move would repeat the exact pattern the palace believed had caused the crisis. As the expected appearance approached, Charles faced his final choice: confront Meghan publicly and risk an even greater explosion, or remain silent and allow distance to become permanent estrangement. The scandal had now moved beyond one leaked detail. It had become a struggle over who controlled the truth, who defined betrayal, and whether the monarchy and the Sussexes could ever speak privately without preparing for the next public war. In the end, the most devastating consequence was not a headline, a cancelled invitation, or another wave of public criticism. It was the slow disappearance of trust. Charles had taken one last emotional risk, Meghan had defended herself through the channels she understood, and Harry was left between two worlds. One leaked condition had destroyed what months of careful silence had barely begun to build. The private channel was no longer a bridge. It had become evidence, proof to each side, that the other could not be trusted. Charles reportedly reached a painful conclusion. Affection alone could not protect the monarchy. Any future relationship with Harry would require firm institutional boundaries, strict discretion, and safeguards strong enough to survive personal emotion. He could love his son and still refuse him unguarded access. Meghan saw the agreement differently. To her, it had never been a genuine peace offering. It was a test built around silence, with rules created by the palace and consequences waiting if she resisted. She believed she had been asked not merely to protect privacy, but to surrender her ability to answer accusations. Harry was left carrying the grief of both interpretations. His father believed confidence had been betrayed. His wife believed she had been placed inside another trap. Each side possessed messages, timelines, and memories supporting its own version. Neither was willing to accept the other's truth. Future communication would now likely pass through lawyers, officials, and tightly controlled written exchanges. William regarded the incident as final proof that distance was safer than reconciliation. Every reopened door, he believed, created another risk for the crown. The promise itself had become deeply symbolic. Charles believed he had offered Meghan a private path forward. Meghan believed the price of that path was silence on terms she did not control. The true origin of the leak might remain disputed. Someone within her wider circle may even have acted without full permission, turning private frustration into public narrative before she understood what had happened. If so, the damage was unintended, but no less permanent. The palace might never reveal its complete evidence, because proving its case would mean exposing the royal conversations it claimed to protect. That was the final tragedy. Everyone said they wanted privacy. Yet every attempt at peace created another headline, another suspicion, and another reason to retreat. But one secret remained untouched, a separate conversation involving Harry himself, whose contents could reopen the entire conflict. And as both sides retreat behind silence, one unresolved question remains. If the first promise collapsed within days, what happened during the secret conversation Harry has still refused to discuss?